Robert McCammon's Swan Song is a long, convoluted mess with dozens of characters and a ridiculous plotline, but don't let that stop you. I read Swan Song when I was in my mid-teens. I was 14, 15, 16, somewhere around that age, when I first read Swan Song, and it really made an impression with me. I've already reread it once, and I'm pretty certain that I am going to read it again. This is by far and large Robert McCammon's longest book. It sits at 956 pages. That is approximately 340,000 words, so this is a beefy novel. This book has been given quite a lot of flack over the years for being more or less just a rip-off of Stephen King's The Stand. However, I think that's a little unfair to say it's purely a rip-off. Both of them are post-apocalyptic novels that deal with good versus evil themes and some truly harrowing subject matter. Both stories feature the entire planet getting wiped out, or at least the vast majority of the planet getting snuffed out due to one reason or another. It's got nuclear war in this one as opposed to Captain Trips. There's also, the ancient evil that roams the land after the apocalypse that ties them together. Clearly, Robert McCammon was at least inspired by The Stand. In Swan Song, nuclear war brings a swift end to modern life. Billions die in an instant, and the earth turns sour, unable to grow. The post-war landscape is a nightmare of burnt remnants, populated by the unlucky survivors who struggle for food, shelter, and safety from the maniacs who would kill, or worse, without warning. The only hope for humanity rests in a young girl named Swan, whose untapped ability might save what's left of a fractured world, and others hear the call to protect her. However, wandering the waste is an ancient evil, a shape-shifting man with many names and talents who seeks to destroy Swan and anyone sworn to protect her. The plot itself is pretty all over the place. There are dozens of characters within this book. There are definitively a handful of main characters that we follow. Probably the biggest problem with his writing in this book for me is just that it can sometimes feel, you can get a little bit of whiplash going from character to character to character. But that's just a personal problem, really, That's not going to bother some people nearly as much as it bothers me. His writing is also very clunky. He went to the Dean Koontz school of writing things in that it's definitely functional, it gets the job done, but oh boy, he really could have spent a lot more time prettying up. His prose and his syntax could just be tightened up quite a bit and come off a lot cleaner than it does. However, this is a post-nuclear war novel, so a little grittiness, a little, it's not bad that it feels a little bit raw. But there are so many characters, so many different situations, and we span across the entire country. You see New York in this book, you see West Virginia, you see Kansas, you see Utah, and that's just to start. I can't even remember every single state. Well, not that they exactly visit the states, because the states don't exactly exist anymore. So this book is all over the place. There is a bunch of shit that happens in this book, and you'd be forgiven for not remembering everything, because I certainly don't either. Swan Song certainly has an ensemble cast. There are so many different characters in here that I will not be able to go through all of them. Again, I don't even remember every single character that shows up in this book, because there are quite a number of them. But we're just going to go over the most important ones. We'll go ahead and start with Swan, because she is who the book is named after. Swan is a little girl that comes from a small little trailer park, and she has a hard knock life and everything before the nukes go off. After the nukes go off, she very slowly discovers that she has abilities, supernatural abilities. Swan herself wasn't a super great character. She was just, there was no real divisiveness with her character. We don't really worry about whether or not she's going to do the right thing. She's just very clearly written to be the good, the goodest good there can be, The next character we'll talk about is Sister, and Sister is my favorite character. She is first referred to as Sister Creep. She was just a homeless lady in, I was about to say Los Angeles. She was a homeless lady in New York before the bombs fell, and after the bombs fell, that kind of altered her personality. She was absolutely insane when you first meet her. However, oddly enough, she kind of pulls it together in the nuclear hellscape and finds a reason to keep living and actually want to struggle and persevere and keep going on. You never get to know her name throughout the story, which is, you never get to know her given name throughout the story, but she does take on the name Sister to, be her actual name. Sister is definitely my favorite character. Sister, God, I love her. She's actually maybe my favorite character that Robert McCammon ever wrote. Josh is the last of the three main good guy characters. Josh is, he's a real tall dude. He ends up being the first person to hear the call to protect Swan, and so he takes that shit really seriously. Josh is another one of those knight in shining armor kind of characters. McCammon often does that. Again, he went to the Dean Koontz school of writing things, so his good guys are often just pretty straight-cut good guys. Not all the time, but usually. The bad guys in this book are pretty memorable. Colonel Macklin is pretty fun. It's really good to watch him slip from, what seems to be a fairly respected military man into, a hardcore, terrible fucking dictator that runs the Army of Excellence. Wow, yeah, he is just a brutal asshole. But even more brutal than him is his right-hand man, Roland. Roland is pretty fucked up. Pretty savage in this book, especially in the second half, right? After all of the years pass and we get to see him in his full capacity. Wow, yeah, he's kind of an asshole. I feel kind of bad for Roland. His parents die and Colonel Macklin takes him on and just really warps his mind and just manipulates the fuck out of him and eventually brings him to be his right-hand man who is willing to do anything for Colonel Macklin. So the relationship between them is pretty believable and strong. The last major evil character is, of course, the man with the scarlet eye, the guy that is just kind of a ripoff of Randall Flagg. He's just a shoe-in for the devil, for the most part. That's what he's supposed to be. He was pulled off pretty well. He was not overutilized. The couple of times he was brought in, he did some pretty creepy stuff. The flies were interesting. I do want to just mention a couple of characters right quick. We're not going to talk about them deeply. I just want to mention them right quick because they were at least memorable, despite not being the largest characters in the book. These are just some prominent secondary characters. Paul, the old hunter that Sister meets just outside of New York. I loved Paul, and I wish he was in the book a little bit more. Robin is a kid that they meet later on into the book, and he's not my favorite character, but he's alright. Sheila. I feel very bad for Sheila. Fucking Roland and Macklin end up finding her just outside of Salt Lake City, and oh man, her whole story is pretty depressing. Kempa, dude, what a fucking creep, right? Kempa was actually a very slight inspiration. I had him in mind when I was writing Mr. Q in the Circus. So yeah, this guy was, man, Kempa was awful. Kempa was pretty awful. Alvin was pretty fucking nuts. There are tons more characters, of course, that I didn't mention. Yeah, Leona was interesting. There's so many different characters. Artie, the shoe salesman that Sister met, like, oh man, I wish he stuck around. There are a lot of characters in this book, and all of them do feel fairly unique. Right, we're now into the spoiler territory. We're gonna talk about specific plot points, so there are spoilers here on out. I was very sad to see that all of the people that Sister meets, like as she's going out of New York, as she's like really kind of experiencing those changes like internally for herself, she meets a group of survivors and like they all fucking die. The man with the scarlet eye ends up killing them. That like kind of sucks, because I actually liked specifically Artie, and just like I was really hoping to see that group was going to blossom a little bit, and but no. And then of course, she goes on to go find Paul later, and Paul fucking dies in the book. Of course, Paul was one of my favorite characters, not as much as Sister, but I was honestly hoping that like Paul and Sister would like, I don't know, bud a romance or something, because Sister, she lost her kid, right? At the beginning of the book, she talks about that. It's not really talked about much throughout the entire novel, but it is something that happened to her as a character. So I really think that it could have worked and pulled it a little more full circle if Sister could have actually had her child again. I mean, granted, sure, Swan is kind of supposed to feel like her surrogate kid, like, she and Josh are kind of supposed to be the surrogate parents for him, but they're for Swan, but I don't know. I really wish that Sister would have gotten with Paul and they could have had a kid. I think that really could have been, I would have loved to have seen that for those two characters, personally. Oh my god, yeah, the straitjacket game was one of the most fun parts of the book for me, personally. Having Josh tied up in that straitjacket and having to haul ass through, was it I think a Kmart? Or was it a Home Depot? I can't remember what. It was some home store that he has to run through. Well, there's just these maniacs trying to kill him, and like with all sorts of different tools of the trade. So that whole section was really stressful, but I loved it. I loved the straitjacket game. The magic ring that Sister finds is interesting, but a little bit underutilized. It certainly comes into play several times throughout the book. He doesn't forget about it. It's not a wasted plot point. I just wish that there was a little bit more to it than what we were given. There's a part right after Colonel Macklin and Roland get to Salt Lake City and actually kind of talk their way into Kempis Camp. There's a part where they not they, but somebody else pretty unceremoniously kills a kid. And man, that part really stuck out to me when I first read the book. And the second time I read it through, it was still pretty disturbing, but not nearly as shocking as the first time I did. Now granted, this was one of the earlier books that I did choose to read outside of Stephen King, so it very well might have affected me just so much because I didn't have anything else really to compare it to at the time. However, I will still admit, I went back and read that little section before we did this, and it still does get to me a little bit, so I don't know, Robert McCammon does his job. So yeah, the 7-year jump in the middle of the book really threw me off the first time I got there, because, like, the first 450 pages of this book are set, I want to say over the course of a couple of months maximum, I'm going to guess. And then all of a sudden we get to part 2 of the book, the second half of the book, and it just jumps forward 7 years, which really kind of threw me off, but, whatever. It was just an interesting thing. As I said earlier, the man with the scarlet eye was not overutilized, and he was well utilized when he was there. Perhaps my favorite instance of seeing him was at one point, he's just kind of riding this bike along, and then he stops, and he just, like, the way that McCammon describes it, he just opens his mouth, and I imagined his mouth just like opening and just keep opening and keep opening, and these flies start crawling out and falling out on, like, I don't know, man, like, it was a really creepy and cool imagery for me, and every time I reread that scene, I feel very well rewarded. The Job's mask, the weird growths on the people's faces that end up changing their faces, was a great idea. I loved that. At first I thought it was just, the effects of radiation poisoning, which I'm sure is what you're supposed to think. I think that's what Robert McCammon was trying to go for. And it was so really good to see them crack open and to have them be different, have people's faces actually change over time and, have that reflect the kind of personality that they have underneath the skin. Having the President of the United States not only survive nuclear war, but also survive until, like, literally the very end of the book, so that, there can be the whole Talon program and possibly fucking nuke the Arctic and stuff like that to melt all the ice. Pretty crazy, pretty nuts. Also, I love the chapter titles in this book. I don't know why, but the chapter titles are just really specifically call out to me. A couple of my favorites, Come a Cropper, Big Fist-a-Knockin', The Waiting Magnum, and The Straitjacket Game, because I talked about The Straitjacket Game earlier, and I love that section, and I also love the title of the chapter. It's so much that I remember it to this day. I would have to rate Swan Song with a B+. The plot is messy, but the characters and situations are memorable enough to make up for it. The pacing does not ever slow down too much, and considering the length of the book and how many characters it has to balance, that's quite a feat. And of course, the horror inside this horror novel is properly horrific, so I would definitely suggest this book. Am I going to reread Swan Song? Yes, absolutely. I really want to reread this one. I'm certain that I'm going to again in my life. This one is absolutely my favorite Robert McCammon novel. I haven't read everything that he's put out, but I've read most of his stuff, and Swan Song, hands down, my favorite. Another book that I'm going to have to reread soon is The Circus, an American Fantasy. That's my book. Surprise, I'm going to sell you shit. This is The Circus, an American Fantasy. Penny Robinson finds herself trapped in an enormous, otherworldly circus where capitalism is king, crime runs rampant, and souls are currency. The only chance for survival is to abandon morality and bend to the whims of the circus dictator, or risk her life and break the system she's become trapped in. I also have Portraits in Bloodlines. Portraits in Bloodlines is 23 short stories in the horror, slipstream, science fiction, and fantasy subgenres. A little bit of everything for everyone in Portraits in Bloodlines. I also have a large and growing film collection. If you're curious about that, head over to my wife's channel. She is documenting our collection process. That's all, so thank you for being here and hanging out. He's another kind of one of those knight in shining character